Welcome to Monetizing Innovation. I'm John Holcomb, the best-selling author of Creating Value Faster. Innovation isn't just a big idea on the whiteboard. It's the hard decisions, the missed signals, and the leaders who keep moving forward anyway. This show dives into the real stories behind breakthroughs in life sciences, healthcare, and tech, how ideas become results, and how teams align under pressure, and how strategy turns into execution. If you're building something bold or looking for clarity to lead with confidence, you're in the right place. And today we have a very special guest. We're joined by Hardeep Kaur, a seasoned leader in the pharmaceutical industry with deep experience driving innovation, operational excellence, and strategic growth across complex healthcare environments. Hardeep has worked at the intersection of science, business, and execution, helping organizations navigate the challenges of commercialization, transformation, and delivering value in a highly regulated market. Known for her ability to align cross functional teams and turn strategy into measurable impact, she brings a practical perspective on leadership and the rapidly evolving pharma landscape. In this episode, we explore innovation in healthcare, scaling execution, and the future of value creation across the pharma industry. Thank you so much, Hardeep, for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, John. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm excited to be here and share a plethora of experiences and stories part of my experience. Yes.
No, absolutely. And I think with your journey through the pharma space, you have such a unique perspective, but then also a great way to look at how is the industry moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, with, all the technology advances, right? So we're sitting at the intersection of process, people, technology, and that's something I'm extremely passionate about. So I think you mentioned in the introduction, I have been working on the business transformation space for a little while now. I've done like small transformations from impacting 500 employees all the way up to like 30,000 employees. And what I find is, yes, technology is extremely important, partnership is really important, but what sits at the intersection of all of those three is even further important. Because if I look at the progress that is happening from an AI space, yeah, that can absolutely, help us sort of design better clinical trials, for example, right? If I look at the data and insights, we can decipher a lot from what is happening with our patients and so forth. But all that individually doesn't really bring value. I think it's the intersection of the, people process technology is what drives it. So, yes, very exciting. I think I'm looking forward to the advancements that are going to be made through that intersection.
And I think that, like you said, that intersection is just so important. And, I think one of those critical components, right, which you've done a great job over the years is really bringing that people aspect into that intersection, right? Making sure that, leading some of these difficult decisions. Would you care to share any of your experience on some of that, especially with, you know, some of I'd say the fast moving pace right now of where we are with AI introduction and everything else?
Yeah, I would love to. And I think with people, it's extremely dynamic, right? So I'll share maybe the sort of the, cross section of at the leadership level and the middle management level, and then obviously at the main employee level as well. So for me, I think people are the most important element of transformation, right? So you can have your best processes, you can
Mhm.
have your best technology, but if you haven't really shifted the jobs, the way people are actually working, you haven't transformed anything in your business. So when I kind of think about whether it's change or transformation or innovation, at the leadership level, you're sort of setting the direction. You're really providing people that clarity that is important, right, for them to actually take that journey. When it comes to the middle management level, they are shepherding people through that transformation, if you will, right? They're supporting the individuals as they go through the journey, and then obviously at the very sort of the rudimentary but the most important layer, which is really all employees that have to go through the changes. There's a lot going on there, and there's a support that's needed. There's clarity that's needed. There is resources that they're going to be needing. There is going to be skills and capabilities that have to be developed in new ways of working. So I feel like each of those layers, you cannot just sort of undermine the amount of work that's needed in the people space. So I've always been a sort of big proponent, if you will, that we cannot leave people behind. In fact, I think we always need to make sure that the strategic element of people are is part of your transformation journey, if not later earlier. Yeah.
I completely agree, right? Because if folks really aren't bought into the change, right, it can really be, it can backfire in terms of what the strategic direction is intended to be, right? And
Yes.
it's sort of that activation energy. You need that activation energy of what's in it for me type, for a lot of folks, and that message changes depending on where you're in the organization, right? And maybe you could speak to that a little bit with some of the work you've done.
Absolutely. And I often get asked this question, right? Like, why do people resist change? And, it's interesting if you start to unpack resistance, to me, it's first of all, it's a data point, right? Like, you can do so much with that data point. People are resisting because, clearly something is shifting for them. But I think the bigger shift is really the loss in identity, right? So, I look at it from that perspective because when you hire people or you bring people in or they're part of a certain role, they are so proud how they're contributing and they start to associate their personal identity with that particular role in terms of the outcome that are produced for that role. So once you start to produce change, it's actually really sort of shuffling their identity, right? So the more you start to understand what is actually happening behind the scenes and internally with these individuals, the better off change we will be able to, to deploy, if you will. And the plans are, I think they're great, right? Change plans are great because they talk about how, people shift through that change curve. All that's really important, but I think majority of the time people, if they're heard, if they're understood, if you're really listening to them and how the change can be shaped along with them, right? It's extremely helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I've definitely seen throughout my journey as well that, you know, if folks feel like they have an ownership stake in that decision and they know what piece of the change that they own, they're often much more receptive, right? To, okay, well, yep, I know it's going to be different. I know my identity has to shift a little, but I can understand why, right? It's connecting the what and the why. I think sometimes is really the difficult part, right? With some of these large changes.
Absolutely.
Well, it's interesting too because I know, in the beginning you talked about too with just some of the new technology coming online and some of the different things that are happening. And pharma is such an interesting space, right? Because we have AI from a couple fronts. There's the large language models that we're all probably using with Chat GPT, Claude, those types of tools. But then within the pharma space, right, there's a lot of potential, but those models, right, are not necessarily appropriate because it's a different data set for what needs to get done in terms of whether it's drug discovery or, like you said, even some of the automation of certain things. What is some of your experience that you've seen, especially just in this rapidly changing landscape?
Yeah. I mean, working in a highly regulatory environment, right? So we have to be extremely cautious. But there has been a lot of experimentation that has happened, even within the confined regulatory space. So yes, clinical trials is one. Looking at data sets. So in the manufacturing space, we've definitely used AI in the commercial space as well in terms of getting patients' insights, right? How do we develop better models? There is also usage in the content creation space. So yes, I think one of the things that I'm a firm believer of is like you can't necessarily have an AI strategy. It's really you need to look at your business strategy. You need to look at where the business problems are and where can you use some of these tools because AI is just a tool, right? How can you use the tool to solve those business problems? So I think, and pharma, I believe, has done a very, very good job in terms of understanding where some of the roadblocks and where some of the barriers are to the supply chain, for example, right, to the discovery cycle. So I believe if you look at the problems, right, where they are, and then start to put the AI solutions on there, it can definitely help. And that's really what the focus has been.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think, you know, sometimes I think for pharma, that's been part of what has been very helpful, right? Is the regulation because it does make folks think about, well, what is the problem we're trying to solve, right? Versus I feel like in the news and everything we see today, right? The whole all the AI hype and things like that, yeah, it can get blown out of proportion when I mean AI has been around for years,
Yeah.
but machine learning, all that, but a lot of times, folks don't see it in the same way that they're seeing it now.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. Like, I think with technology, what's happening is the computing power is just fast, right? So you get better results and faster results, which really adds to the speed. But I think one thing I always sort of look at from a science perspective is, science always creates that possibility, but what really creates an impact is the execution, right? How well is somebody executing? So I think that's the competitive advantage. The pharma is always like, who's going to get to the market fast, right? What does that go to market strategy actually look like? So the technology is there, absolutely, and we should absolutely, use it, right, for the right reasons, because ultimately, when you're making medicine, it is for the patients, right? So we have to keep the patients and the customer in the centric. And when you start to think about how are you going to provide that medicine in a meaningful way? What type of impact are you creating for the patient? How are you bettering their life? Everything else is not important, right? So I think that's the focus. And luckily, and it's a privilege to work for companies where that is the center. Everything else revolves around that. We have been extremely focused on how do we focus on meeting the needs of the patients, right? Unmet medical needs of the patients.
Yeah, I think that's so important because even just in the change discussion that we were talking about a moment ago, right, that I think having that front and center really helps folks understand, like, hey, it's for the patients that we're trying to drive, these changes or improvements. And, I think every time you can come back to that point, it really helps, right? Just in terms of the whole organization embrace it.
Absolutely, it keeps us centered, right? It keeps us centered, like the purpose. Because all these organizations, if you have a very strong purpose and a strong value, you ultimately, every single decision you're making, right, whether it's through a difficult time or through complex situations, you are coming back to that value, you're coming back to that purpose, you were coming back to that something that brings everybody together. So I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think about some of the just some of the things that you've probably seen. Where do you see the greatest opportunities, right, for pharmaceutical companies to really create that differentiated value? I think that patient centric part is so important. And now with the new technology, where do you see some of the direction going?
Yeah, one of the thoughts, as I was listening to you, as sort of phrasing this question, is the alignment, right? So what I find sometimes is even within the internal to the industry, even outside industry, everyone's kind of doing their own thing, right? So much is about siloed, so much is like we all want to get to the same goal, but everyone wants to travel in their own little lane. So I think the integration component or the better partnership component is an opportunity because ultimately we are all trying to solve for the same thing, right? For the patient. So if we all worked together, I think we can create a larger impact. So to me, if I were to think about what could look different, I think we can all work on the misalignment component, right? How can we align ourselves better? I'll give you a perfect example. Like if I look internally, the regulatory team is just focused so much on the regulatory inspections. Then you have like the finance team who's just focused on finance. Then you have like your cross-functional team who's really just looking at their pieces. So you have all of these teams, and rightfully so, because they're all functions within the organization. But I wonder if we all have, pause for a minute and think about the same purpose that's really driving us and have better integration versus all the misalignment that exists. It could help us. I think that's the speed, right, that can be gained by better alignment is going to be the value proposition or differentiation.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, especially when, I think through, because obviously with the regulatory and, we need those folks and the quality folks, right, to really, help that stay front and center and have that quality system and everything in place. But it really does take some of these great leaders, right, to integrate the teams and, sometimes pull some of those folks like in at the right time too, right? Because some of it's the timing of when voices need to be heard, right? If you're an early development, then it's like, hey, we need to have that freedom to experiment. But then when we start moving into the, you know, the drug development process, right, then, things do. Each step gets progressively more regulated. And, can you share any examples from your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's a great question because when I'm sort of recalling, from my manufacturing operations days, and we used to call them quality partners because they literally were good partners. But unfortunately, we don't sometimes see that in that manner because we feel like, oh my gosh, compliance is coming in, it's just telling us what we've done incorrectly or what we've done wrong at all times. But I see a little differently now, right? I feel like, if you are a little bit more disciplined around integrating them or designing quality into your processes, you don't have to think about that at later stages. So I don't believe quality is a roadblock. I think it's actually, it really helps us to speed things up because if you are making quality as part of your design, if you're following your procedures and your SOPs and your manufacturing documents the way they're designed with quality in mind, you are actually going to be speeding up your processes, not necessarily roadblocking them. So I think you said it well, right? Leaders who are disciplined and integrating quality into their processes are it definitely is beneficial because ultimately, I think in any operation there's so much complexity, and complexity is expensive. And if you want to scale something, clarity is what is going to help. And I think quality does help us provide that clarity.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think, it's one of those things that if you don't capture that complexity appropriately early enough, right, you end up scaling more
Yeah.
chaos than you do the actual product that you're trying to produce.
That is absolutely true.
And it's funny because I think you've highlighted too just the importance of that leadership component in there too, right? Of really being able to sometimes be the bridge between the different functional silos. I remember when I was working, in some of my previous work, you know, there was a process engineer and then also a product development engineer. And, you know, it was just kind of funny because you were hearing the two of them talk, right? And the process engineers, well, I need the spec, I need this, and this. And the new product engineer was like, we've never made it before.
Yeah.
I can't give you all those specs. And yeah, so it was really kind of comical. You just had to kind of step in and be the mediator to say, look, you're both are right, but you kind of have to understand where we are. And yeah, so those are some of the funny things when you come across that, right? It's like you don't necessarily appreciate it in your early stages of your career, but you definitely appreciate it as you start, being able to take in some of the different roles and different perspectives.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great analogy, right? So I feel like leaders, like the integrators, right? They have to bring all of the actually the better word would be orchestrators, right? They have to bring
Right.
all these functions together and have to play in harmony, right? In order for you to create a piece of music or in our case a product or a process. So I think I think you're right. And one of the things that come to my mind if you don't do an alignment up front, first of all, it's non-negotiable. But and secondly, you're not necessarily de-risking the problem, right? I mean, all of these risks are going to show up somewhere along your process. So might as well address the issues up front, gain the alignment up front, right? And have that dialogue because oftentimes what is not said is equally important to what is actually said in the room. So I often find, like, you get into the room, people are just kind of nodding, but that's it's quite dangerous sometimes, like really managing those stakeholders, outside of the room, making sure there's alignment, making sure like, "Hey, this is what I meant. Is this really what you mean as well?" That discourse becomes really important, to have that successful process as an integration. Yes.
I completely agree. In fact, sometimes when you just have a bunch of nodding around the room, I get more concerned at that because it's like the issues aren't coming out, right? And we're not necessarily working through, okay, well, what is the challenge that we need to be facing here?
And I find, John, that misalignment is one of the biggest wastes that we create, particularly in the transformation space, right? Because ultimately, no one wants to actually like ask the difficult questions because then you're seen as or perceived as like, oh, you're sort of like the person who's blocking this. Well, you're not. You're really asking the question. So creating that space, and I'm a big believer of creating that safe space and just even having that dialogue and asking the right questions, right? What if scenarios and what are the possibilities and have you tried everything? So but that becomes the role and responsibility of a leader to create that space to have that healthy dialogue up front and clear any of the misalignments because consensus also does not mean that you've agreed on everything and
Except
your
mm,
actions have to reflect that, right? Your activities
yeah.
have to reflect that. Yes.
No, that's so true, and I think, it's always important when we're dealing, especially in these cross-functional environments, right, of the good leader, like you said, has to create the safe space, and it's really challenge the problem, not the person, right, and I
Right.
think, like, it goes back to your identity comment, right? So many folks associate their identity with what they're contributing that and I think the good leaders really have to slow it down a little bit,
Yeah.
right? And say, well, time out. It's not a personal affront. It's a valid question. They're not questioning you. They're questioning, like, do we understand the problem?
Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And I think one of the sort of attributes developed over the years is just being curious, right? So I think if you come across or if you're asking the question in a way that you really want to know the answer, right? Like you are curious about what is the issue we're trying to solve, like what is the problem we're trying to address. It just separates the individual and the emotion and the passion because ultimately, I'm a big believer of everyone, is trying to do their best. Everyone's doing the right job, right? And doing it the right way. And no one's coming in with the intent of sabotaging anything. But so let's just have a dialogue, right? Let's have a conversation so we can understand the different perspective because within that conversation, within that perspective lies the answer, right? People are very smart, they're very intelligent, and they're quite capable of solving the problem. I think leaders should refrain at actually providing the answers. Sometimes just creating that environment and being curious and asking the right questions helps the
Yeah,
team to the problem. Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful perspective, and I think that is so true. And I would definitely agree with you. The best leaders I've seen, definitely have developed that skill over time, right? But yeah, I like to sometimes phrase it as, try to surround yourself with everyone that's smarter than you, and when you're doing some of these things, just assume that everybody in the room is smarter, and then you can be curious and ask the right questions, right?
Yeah. And I recall, to your point, I think it was Steve Jobs who said this, like you hire the smartest people and then you tell them what to do. Well, it doesn't work like that, right? Like you hire the smart people, they will solve the problem. I think it just had to be positioned that way, right?
Yeah. And it's funny because I think you point out that it's just so important, you know, because of the cross section of where things come together, people, process, and just kind of the whole nine yards. It still comes down to part of the people side is the environment that's created. It's enabling folks to do what they're best at, and having that safe place to be able to do so.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that, John, because again, oftentimes, this whole I don't even know if Peter Drucker actually said this culture eats strategy for breakfast, but I think that just goes around and people just butcher it. But nonetheless, I think culture plays a very important role. In fact, I think one of my latest posts I was actually talking about if you think about transformation, right, and if a company has its core values and there's an evolution for that particular team or organization going a certain trajectory, and then you're bringing transformation, and it's so much easier for the company if the culture and the value is actually, set in the direction to where you want to take the transformation versus coming in and constantly changing the process and the technology and the people and the core. It's a lot, right? It becomes a fatigue for individuals. So going back to your question, culture becomes really important, and it is the responsibility of the leadership to create the right culture and create an environment where change can actually happen. I just hope that we stop talking about change as like, something that is happening to people, right? Versus just maybe more focusing on what can we make to do to create an environment where change can happen easily for these individuals. But it's a huge challenge for organization because there's so much going on internally and externally.
Absolutely. And you see it, I think, in so many companies too, right? That, what made the company successful in the first place is now at a different place. And
Yeah.
sometimes they forget, right, that you have to go back to some of that transformation again and bring in, sort of the next part of the business life cycle. And that if you don't have the right culture and environment for it, it can really break fast.
We talk about change capabilities, we talk about change enablement, right? And all that's part of it. It's building that resiliency within the organization because I mean, we all know what happens if you don't change, right? We all understand the speed and the rigor that's required. I mean, there are many examples in front of us of industries where just like, yeah, we're untouchable, right? Invincible. And look what happened to it. And sometimes, the resources are there and most of the time, I think the company is actually aware that they need to move fast. But I think large organization, there are systems which actually hold them back. And we all know the bureaucratic systems that exist sometimes, right? It's just like, yeah. And oftentimes you have to pause and kind of simplify those as well, right? If you want to speed things up. Yeah.
No, I think that's so true. And it's funny. I feel like, sometimes things need to break, right, before
Yeah.
the real change can happen. And, not in all cases, right? I mean,
Yeah.
obviously, when we're talking pharma, there's certain things I think, especially with, the process, the people aspect of it, if things, yeah, if the issue doesn't get surfaced, it doesn't get fixed.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. I mean, that goes back to creating that culture where people feel quite safe to speak up, right? Or where you have systems, right? I think if you
Hmm.
kind of look at the operational excellence part of my role, that's what we focus on. How do you make problems visible? And oftentimes, like we would equate that to okay, something is red on your dashboard, but then you had to build that culture of red does not mean it's bad. Red means that, okay, we have an issue and we need to focus on it to solve it. But that automatically didn't happen. We had to work through that. And otherwise, people will always be like, yeah, we're green, but everything's good to go. Well, that's not true if you start to peel the onion. But again, I think our conversation was around how do you create that environment where the people feel obligated, right? Or feel that it's their responsibility to raise the problems. Now, I must say that you're just not constantly just raising problems. You also have to come to solutions, right? So, bring two solutions and maybe the one most viable and the feasible one will actually go through. And that takes a lot of work, that's culture transformation, right? Organizational transformation.
It really is, and I like what you said there too, because it's really important. I think that for organizations, right, is some of the organizations that have the toughest time are the ones that they try to push the decision up, right, to the next leader versus enabling the person to, like you said, propose a couple solutions. We'll sort out what's best, but like, bring your best proposals and we can hash it out together as a team. you know?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
decision making, right? John, I find like that's another sort of like bottleneck that is often created even within the governance structures, right? Because everything has to be escalated up. No, it doesn't have to be. I think or again, I'm a firm believer that people are very smart, right? And they can solve the problem. In fact, the right problem should be solved at the right layer. So but they have to be empowered. And again, conditions have to be created. And they should know how far what decisions can be made at their level. And that needs to be clear. And oftentimes, I think that not enough time is spent on deriving that clarity within that structure. So then everything needs to be escalated up. And it's not fair on the leader either, right? Because they also have many other responsibilities versus solving the problems that are 5 layers down, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I think that's also just, it goes back to your point around systems as well, right? Is that there's the people aspect, but it's also what systems are in place, that are actually empowering those decisions as well. No, it's,
absolutely.
and it's interesting. I think too, we've focused a lot on some of just like the transformation
Yeah.
side, in the discussion. And when you think about that, what are some of I'd say the key takeaways or key learnings that you would offer other leaders, especially whether they're early in the process or, they're with a large organization? How
Yeah,
would you
wow, there's a lot, as far as the transformation is concerned, but I will say, a couple of things, right? Just be very clear on what are you trying to achieve and what problem you're trying to solve,
Mhm,
right? Because if you really think about transformation, it's really building a future without constraints of the past. So people often get confused between a small initiative of a change and this whole holistic transformation. They're two different
mhm,
things, right? Change can be incremental. You're changing a procedure, you're changing, something very minute. And a whole bunch of them does not mean you're actually transforming the organization. There's a difference. Transformation, on the other side, is a holistic approach to how you're going to be working in the future. And the fundamental thing with transformation is you're really shifting the operating model,
mhm.
right? And when you think about the operating model, is like, how is the work going to flow through the system? How are you going to be making those business decisions, right? Who has that business decision authority and so forth? So it's looking at roles and responsibilities, the jobs that need to be done, all of it holistically, and changes are small and incremental, but having the clarity between and the being clear on the difference between the two, it becomes really, really important. With transformation, please do not leave the people part behind, right? It's the process, is the technology, but without the people, you're not going to be able to, move
Mhm.
forward. Now, with that being said, I think the modern way to drive transformation is through insights, right? There's so much data now that we can actually even get in the people space. So, because many of us are far more comfortable with numbers and data. So, particularly leaders when you have to make business decision. So you can also get a ton of data in the people space, right? With insights and all kinds of, reactions and emotions and all of those things. So use the data, right, to drive and make sure that the process and technology is bringing the people along. So those are like my two major things that I want to leave. Understand the difference between change and transformation, two different things, and then not to leave the people aspect behind. Make sure you consider them as data points and then bringing them.
No, and that's such valuable insight. I couldn't agree more with you because they, they really are two different things. Yeah, as we're nearing the end of our discussion, one thing I'd like to ask, and not to throw you off guard or anything like that, too, but what is something that I haven't asked yet that you think would really be important for the audience to learn about?
I mean, one thing I'll say, this is all great, right? Like
Hmm.
I think large pharmaceuticals or large companies, very purpose driven. They all understand, why they exist, right? Obviously, most of the companies I'm aware of, particularly in the pharma space, like they're doing good and they're doing very well, right? So that's sort of like you're bringing the human aspect in, but always remember that you are trying to serve, right? Serve people, right? All this is great. Like you can add technology to it, you can add processes to it, but ultimately we are here to serve the mankind and the humankind. So never sort of remove that laser focus away from that. I think ultimately everything will follow. The profits will follow, right? The gains will follow. The finances will follow. But the purpose driven, companies that are always focused on driving that value, how do we make our patients' life easier? Yeah, how do we, serve the unmet needs? How do we serve others is fundamentally important. Everything else revolves around it.
Yeah, that is so powerful, and I couldn't agree more. And I think too, it's not just the people that we serve, but it's also being servant leaders, right? And
Yeah.
trying to help. I I really love that insight. That's powerful. Yeah, I have to admit, Hardy, it has been such a pleasure having this discussion, and would love to kind of continue the dialogue here in another episode soon because I think we just scratched the surface of some of the things that you bring to the table with your experience and background, and would love to continue to learn more from you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for the opportunity. I think this was wonderful. I love to talk about my experiences, and I'm glad you gave provided me that opportunity. So thank you again.
Yeah, no, thank you, and especially for our audience, it's great hearing some of these accounts and experiences, right? It helps all of us grow, so I appreciate you helping the community as well. Thank you.
You
All right, we'll talk soon.
take care. Bye bye.